We're going to be continuing looking at Romans, and I think you can see my text, right? Yeah. So we left off last time. We finished verse 4, and here's the markup of that. You can see the video when that's available. I think I will erase some of this, though, and just kind of pick up with, what's going on in verse 4 as we transition into 5. These verses are hard conceptually, and I shared on Facebook groups, my email announcement, just some of the assessments that I found in Richard Longenecker's commentary on Romans. Very tough to understand conceptually what Paul is doing. And I do have some ideas. I'll share those with you. What Paul is up against. I believe, as we will get to today, something very serious is that he is being blasphemed, just as we're blasphemed, and some say that we say. So this is verse 8. And what are they saying that he says? Let us do evil in order that good would come. So that's pretty serious stuff. And I'm just, we're not to that verse yet. We'll mark it up and talk about it. But just to put this discussion in some kind of a framework, that this is a very serious matter for Paul. To be blasphemed is one thing, to be spoken down about, to have your character maligned, be written off. We could look at different texts that would betray that kind of a thing, even as early as First Thessalonians chapter 1 and 2. If you read those passages, Paul is kind of bragging about his character, and when you really listen to it, you could be thinking, oh my gosh, he's a narcissist. Like, why is he going on about his character? Um, well, Bruce Winter wrote a piece, an article about that he was distancing himself from looking like a traveling philosopher trying to make money off of people. And if you go to the book of Acts and which describes Paul's missionary wanderings and trips and preachings, when it comes to Thessalonica, he was run out pretty quickly. Seems to be about 5 weeks. He was there 3 Sabbaths, but you could, start that a little earlier, extend it, so maybe 4 to 5 weeks he might have been there, but he's run off, and it doesn't look good because new converts might be thinking, who is this guy? What's happened? So this issue of Paul's integrity is present in his earliest letters. Thessalonians is one of the earliest. Galatians, it's an issue in Galatians. He ends Galatians and he says, leave me alone. Those of you who are coming at me, I bear on my body the stigmata of Christ. And so this issue of Paul being maligned, being blasphemed, being slandered, we could track that and kind of understand that there is indeed a context for that. And then this other charge, just as some say, this is an indefinite pronoun with a verb of saying. This is an older verb of saying, phemi. It's a third plural. It's a me verb. So you see it every now and then. It's not that common, so it is a little bit odd. And then it goes into indirect discourse, using the infinitive. So there's an infinitive indirect discourse construction there. That's kind of hard. So there's the subject and verbal infinitive. This is the indirect speech. So they say that we say, you know, some say that we say. And then the OT here is teeing this up. This is actually something that is not needed. It's called a recitative OT. And so this is the direct discourse. So this OT is a conjunction, that means that, but it's really setting this up. It's a more prominent kind of offsetting device for direct speech. And then here we have a subjunctive first person plural that is a hortatory subjunctive. Let us do. Let us do the evil things in order that the good things would result. Now, all of this is part of a question that goes back to a question expecting a negative response. We'll look at this again, but as a framework, I just want to say that this is very serious stuff when Paul not only is being maligned, his a summary of his message is essentially immorality. Let's do bad things. Now, why would Paul be accused of saying, let's do bad things in order that good results? That's an important question to ask. And the answer to that, I think, is simply this, is that Paul did not promote law observance among his Gentile converts, those who are coming to Christ from among the nations. He did not say you need to keep obeying the law. And this is obviously a someone looking from the outside, particularly Judean missionary rivals or people in the synagogues, Jews, Judeans from the synagogues would think that this is terrible, right? If you don't come under the law, if you don't subscribe to the law, if you don't try to follow the law, you're basically lawless. And if you're lawless, you're immoral. You're promoting evil. This, I think, is what lies behind this kind of charge that is facing Paul. And this then is where our text is going to come out, it's going to surface in verse 8. And I just wanted you to kind of understand that this background is, I think, it actually informs why Paul was describing in chapter 2 people from the nations, the Gentiles, who are having the law written on their heart. They're doing the things of the law. They're fulfilling the law. They're doing the righteous requirements of the law. These are all direct quotations from Paul's Greek in chapter 2, 2:14 to the end. And so why? And then Paul says, this is according to my gospel. And scholars, there in 2:16, they wonder, why does Paul refer to his gospel here? Who are these Gentiles that, are these hypothetical? Are they real? I have argued that they're actually Gentile believers who are able to have Jeremiah 31, the law written on their heart. And they have the Spirit, they have a circumcision in their heart. They have the law written in their heart. They have a circumcision in their heart. And this was something that God was wanting for his people to have. So it's important for Paul to establish that he is not against the law in the sense that he's not against goodness and not against people being rightfully lawful or doing the righteous requirements of the law or doing the kinds of things of the law. Because, in fact, his gospel encourages a high moral ethic that comes by being empowered by the Spirit. So we're going to get there in chapter 5 and 6. He works that out. And then chapter 7 and 8, he talks about walking by the Spirit. But right now, in the first three chapters of Romans, he's establishing kind of several things at once. First, everyone is sinful. Everyone has a struggle with sin, even though there are high points that you could, vantage points that could seem to be superior, but leads to judging of others, and when one is a hypocrite, you're doing the same things. That's it. That's not a good thing. So everyone is sinful, although you have some people judging other people when they're guilty of the same things. And Paul says that's to be condemned. He's also establishing that God provides a way out by calling people to repentance. So in chapter 2, verses was it 4, 5, there is this God's kindness is to lead to repentance. And so there does need to be a movement away from sin. This is certainly possible in the gospel. And all of this then, so that those are two things. And then the third thing is that his gospel actually is encouraging the doing of the good, doing the things of the law, the righteous requirements of the law, the things that promote righteousness under the law, the righteousness that the law points to. Now, what is righteousness? Righteousness, I would say, is simply rightly relating to one another. And the law certainly teaches a lot of rightly relating. To God, it was a matter of faithfulness in terms of the covenants and sacrifices, not going into idolatry, in terms of treatment of one another. That's rightly relating. But as we're going to see in the next verses, 10, we might get there today, there is an understanding from the law that there is no one is righteous. No one is righteous. So even though the law attests to righteousness and what it entails, and there's some basic provisions of how to remain in right relationship with God and one another, in general, there is a very serious failure that no one is righteous. We all have a problem. Okay, so he's going to get to that point. And so these verses 1 to 8 of Romans are really kind of moving us in that direction. So if you can watch the video from last time, you can see how we dealt with these verses. But basically, these verses are building off of chapter 2, starting with, what is the advantage of being a Jew? What is the advantage of circumcision? So if there are Gentiles that have the law in their hearts, if there are Gentiles or uncircumcised people that have a kind of circumcision ascribed to them or reckoned to them, then what is the advantage of physical and actual circumcision? And what's the advantage of being a Judean or having the law? Paul says, much in every way. First, they're entrusted with the oracles of God, which means the scriptures. They were entrusted with the scriptures. But then, as we saw last time, some were unfaithful. If some were unfaithful, their unfaithfulness does not annul the faithfulness of God. Does it? And this may expects a negative answer. So their unrighteousness doesn't annul the faithfulness of God. So God is faithful in this process, even though we are unfaithful. Now, what's interesting is that Paul says some are unfaithful. Why doesn't he say all? Well, I think because there are some people who responded to God's faithfulness in the gospel. And so that's how you remain faithful. You remain faithful to God by remaining in covenantal relationship with him. And if God shows that the former covenant is over, which is what Jesus shows, that there's a new covenant that is in place of, or that the old covenant points us to. But I think there is a termination of the old covenant. But the new covenant is now established. And Paul is actually going to come out at the end of chapter 3. He's going to talk about the righteousness of God, the rightly relatingness of God now revealed, attested to by the law and the prophets. He's going to talk about this at the end of chapter 3. So he's getting there. But right now he's dealing with this issue of unfaithfulness, whether some people's unfaithfulness nullifies the faithfulness of God. And Paul says, no, it doesn't. That's a question expecting a negative answer. And then he also says, no way. And he says, moreover, let God be true and let every man, every person be a liar. Okay, so this is where we ended last time, was looking at this statement that every person has a falsehood issue. That's another way of talking about our sin problem. A falsehood issue. We're a liar. Hypocrisy is a kind of lying. I think virtue signaling is a kind of lying, where we want to present ourselves in a certain kind of light. And by condemning others and showing outrage at others, we're actually able to hide behind that outrage. So this is happening a lot, I believe, in our culture right now. Facebook is full of this, and it's on both sides. But yeah, this is a fundamental human problem, is that we overrepresent ourselves, we misrepresent ourselves, and this is what is addressed in the gospel. And this is all kind of exposed as a kind of falsehood. God is true, we're false. We're false, just as it is written. Now, we saw last time that this quotation is from Psalm 51. This is David's psalm where he confesses. In the previous verse that's not quoted here, he's saying, I'm sinful. You are righteous in your words. That is God. God is the you. And you will conquer. You will be victorious in your judging. And this is a prepositional infinitive construction with the accusative subject working with the infinitive in your judging. Now, it's interesting that it's a middle voice, that God is judging with his own interests in mind, which probably is, I think, would suggest that indeed, and this is really what's at stake in the gospel, is how does God demonstrate his righteousness? Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe. For in it the righteousness of God is being revealed. So the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. And part of that righteousness of God is his condemnation of sin. Equally, Jew, Judean, non-Jew, Greek, equally. Everyone is accountable before God, and God establishes that righteousness in his judgment. Now, here there's an interesting elevation. I probably mentioned this last time. This is a future indicative and not a subjunctive. When we're looking with opos on, we're typically looking for subjunctive mood verbs. I was talking to my class, advanced discourse Greek grammar class this semester, and as I've been looking through this material, talking to them about this passage, one of my students rightly went back to the Septuagint, and he said, wow, this verb nikaesis in the Septuagint is a subjunctive. So why did Paul change it to the future indicative here? Why would he do that? Is it a mistake? Is it blah, blah, blah? It's intentional. It's intentional that God is the judging one. Because the future indicative, as opposed to the subjunctive, the future indicative makes it more vivid, more concrete than the subjunctive. And so that's, I think, what's going on here. And this is precisely the point, is that God is making right judgments with his people, his own people. And so this conversation that Paul is having is really about an internal dialogue that he's having with a Jewish, probably Judean kinsfolk. They're discussing things about the people of God, the historic people of God. And so from their own scriptures, from Paul's own scriptures, from his interlocutors, the person that he's having this kind of dialogue back and forth, from their own scriptures, which is a benefit of being a Judean. It's a benefit, and being circumcised. That's the benefit. But their own logia, their own words of God, condemn them. And that's kind of an uncomfortable place to be in. And so that's what he's doing here. He's saying, and God is judging, and you are vindicated, you're victorious in your judging. So God has something at stake here, because he wants his people to be holy. He's always wanted his people to be holy. A chosen people who are holy belong to him, and they reflect his character. We bear his name appropriately. Okay, so we're going to pick up in verse 5 here. All that is a preamble to get to understand these verses. So 5, ide e adikia emon theou dikeosune sun istesin ti erumen. What will we say? So E starts a conditional clause. That's a connector, subordinating connector. But if our unrighteousness, moreover, if our unrighteousness, now dikeosunein is accusative, and then theou is a fronted genitive, establishes, if this establishes, so this is a third singular ending on a me verb. Now with me verbs that fronted, it's from istemi or soon istemi. With me verbs, they have this iota, which is a part of what's called a false reduplication, which is present on the present tense forms. And this is one way to help you parse these verbs, is if you see this iota, like on didomi, tithemi, the di and the ti at the front, that stays with the first principal part forms, the present tense and imperfect tense. So when you see that initial iota, or that, which is part of this reduplication, this false reduplication, tithemi, didomi, that di is a false reduplication. If you see that, you know that you're dealing with the first principal part verb form, present or imperfect tense. So that's one way to help parse these verb forms. Otherwise, you have to then you have to learn also the different formations of first, second, third forms and that kind of stuff. So this is a present tense, third singular, present. It's a present active and indicative. So if our unrighteousness establishes the righteousness of God, what will we say? Okay, so at this point, this is a question. It's an open question. What are we going to say to the situation? Like, if indeed our sinfulness, our falsehood, if God, in dealing with that, rightly condemns it, in a sense, right, that our sinfulness, that situation, establishes God's rightly relating to us by condemning sin. It establishes God's righteousness. So what are we going to say about that, right? Because, right, you could go, well, later on, right, Paul's going to work this to that slander of his gospel message. You could say, well, let us just keep sinning then. Like our sin really doesn't matter because we can't do anything about it. and it also just offsets God's mercy and grace and his righteousness. Well, that's a terrible conclusion. So this is why Paul is he's identifying this question, and then he's going to condemn it. So here, the next verse, you got a may, which is setting up a question expecting a negative response. It's not that God is unrighteous, the one who bears or brings on the wrath, is it? So that's how I'd ask that question. It's always tricky to learn how to phrase questions expecting negative or positive responses. So with negative responses, you can set up the question this way: it's not that, and then you end by saying, is it? So it's not that God is unrighteous, bringing the wrath, is it? And then the answer would be no, it's not. So let's pack apart this, unpack this grammar a little bit. This is atikos is a predicate adjective. It's in the predicate position. So that's typically the adjective is first without an article. Then you have the subject with the article. This is a verbless construction. It's a null copula. So there's an implied verb. It's part of the construction. Sometimes you can have the explicit verb. You could have estin. And then you have, I put an equal sign here. What you have is a participle, epifero, and it's either an appositional. That's why I put an equal sign if it's appositional, or it's an attributive participle. And it's probably more likely an attributive participle. So what that means is that the article is the article with the participle is further qualifying God. Now it's kind of hard to translate, and I think to translate it as a substantive actually brings out the what this attribute is, because basically what's happening is that God is being shown to be one who can bring the wrath. He can bring it down. And so how do we translate in English? I mean, I kind of wanted to say God is not unrighteous when God brings the wrath. I wanted to make this into a like a when clause or while. The problem is that this is indeed a present tense participle. You know, as God brings the wrath, but that turns it into a circumstantial participle, which means that there's no article. So circumstantial participle would not have an article at the front. So that my temptation is to make this into English into a temporal or some kind of subordinate clause, but the marking in the Greek text, the grammar, the construction is not that. It is either an attribute of God, an attributive adjective, or we could understand it as like an appositional statement about God, that he is the one who brings the wrath. Either way, those are rather strong statements about God, that God does indeed need to bring wrath. Now, we could question that. Why does God need to bring the wrath? Well, he does. The wrath of God is being revealed. If you go back to Romans 1:8, God's wrath is being revealed from heaven. There it is present tense, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people. So Paul has already explained this, argued this, how this works out. There's an ordo damnationis, an order of damnation that is described here. And you can go back to those videos. They're not quite released yet, but they will be. So God's righteousness is being revealed in the gospel. And I would say simultaneously, God's wrath is being revealed at the same time. And you don't have to look too hard to understand this, but we often don't think of those things as being together, but they indeed are. You go back to John the Baptist, look at Luke chapter 3, and John is preaching repentance, and he says to the people coming to him, "Who told you to flee the coming wrath?" Orge, it's the same word, orge. And in the historical context of John the Baptist preaching, in the context of Luke's gospel, the word orge only occurs twice in Luke's gospel, there in chapter 3 and in, I think it's chapter 19, or is it chapter 21, where Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem because God's wrath is coming against Jerusalem. We're talking about the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Indeed, God's wrath does come, and God is one who attributively or substantively brings the wrath. Now, that's a part of God's nature, that he opposes sinfulness, or that really sin opposes him. Sin opposes him. And somehow in this world, we can understand God's wrath in terms of like a natural set of outworking consequences. I think there is a moral fabric to this world. I sometimes think we could kind of pop into the world of evil spirits and Satan. I presented a lecture, set of lectures, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago now, I can't remember, on evil forces and Satan. And it seems as if God allows Satan to exist to be an executor of judgment. And even in doing that, he is going to be judged as well. So what's the mechanisms that God puts in place to punish sin? And really the punishment is, it's chastising for the sake of moving us away from sin. Like any good father or mother who has children that know better, there's a point where you have to lay down punishment, bring the wrath, bring the rod or the wrath, or whatever that looks like. I'm not saying abuse your children, of course not. You have to discipline them, though. Hebrews 12 talks about this discipline. So Paul is saying here, it's not as though God is unjust, the one bringing the wrath, right? God's not unjust, who brings wrath. Obviously, when he brings wrath, that is actually establishing his righteousness, his upholding of right conduct. This is why I think this is part of the messaging, is that God is indeed right to condemn sin. He absolutely is, and it's for our own good. And this is, I don't know, I think it's a part of a larger cultural problem right now, is that we don't see people being receiving the consequences. And this happens in our churches. There are people sometimes who are doing terrible things and they're not properly rebuked, not properly. It doesn't happen that often, but it seems like the church struggles with this. People can just jump from one church to the next. And then when we see it with their politicians, it's particularly egregious. When people at highest levels are doing it, lead pastors or other people. As we continue on here, Paul makes a qualifying statement. I'm speaking in human terms, according to a person. He says, I'm speaking in human terms. So this is what's called a meta comment. So a meta comment, MC, is when an author takes a step back from their communication to comment about the communication. And so this is an offsetting kind of device. It indicates epistemic stance towards what's being communicated. Here it's a clarifying statement. I'm speaking in human terms. So in human terms, what's being said in human terms is, that God could be unrighteous. Like that's unthinkable. I mean, in fact, the only way I'm saying that is I'm just speaking, as if we could treat God like a human being and maybe potentially, possibly even think that he's unrighteous. No way. And that's what Paul says. He says, no way. God is indeed not unrighteous, the one who brings wrath. Paul says, no way. I'm just speaking in human terms. Don't think that this is a real question of mine. I'm speaking in human terms. No way. And he substantiates that by way of epi. Now, epi is kind of interesting because it's usually a subordinating conjunction. Usually we would expect a gar. Gar would be used for an independent proposition to provide support, but he's using epi here. Now, this is where I need to do more work, or someone needs to do more work. Maybe they have done some work, differentiating different conjunctions, independent or subordinate, that indicate support for a previous statement or proposition. Gar is for independent propositions supporting what has gone before. Kevin Sutherland, in a book of essays that I just published, he's got a whole essay looking at the use of gar, and I think he's looking at the Petrine epistles. So if you want to see that, I can get that article to you. Kevin did a great job trying to understand how that gar functions. But for subordinate clauses, you could use OT, which is kind of bland, but it's probably the default. And then you have epi. But here, epi seems to be being used to almost like an independent conjunction like gar. So I need to study more why epi would be used here. For how, and this is an interrogative adverb, how will God judge the world? Okay, at this point, we got a future from krino. I know it's future because the sigma, you normally expect a sigma for the future, but it does not like being combined with the new. And so what happens is there's an epsilon that's put between the new and the sigma. But then when you have an epsilon with sigma with an epsilon iota, that the sigma doesn't like to stay in that situation. So then you have an epsilon with an epsilon iota, accent would fall there. When those combined, you get a weird looking circumflex accent. That is a future third singular, future indicative. How will God, I'm single underlining judge and God, how will God judge the world? So basically here it's a question that is supporting that God is not unrighteous. God is not unrighteous. He's not unrighteous, for how will he judge the world? And this is kind of I think a general understanding that God has a right, God has the ability, the right, the prerogative, and the future commitment to judge the world. And we're all kind of waiting for that. Or we're not. Are we is this a good thing or a bad thing? But it is part of our hope is that someday this corrupt, evil world, the world that we live in now, that is hurtful, harmful, we want, and everyone wants justice. We want things to be set right. This is part of the vision of setting things right. That entails, however, as much as we want to get to the garden, we want to be in the heavenly city, we want the city and the garden and the water of life flowing through the middle, and there's no temple because God is in our midst, and we want that kind of reality. And we can experience that to some extent. We want that reality, but to get to that reality, there has to be a removal of sin and there has to be a judgment. And thank God that God is just and righteous and true and good and merciful. Thank God that God will do that. And so that's what Paul is saying here. Now, there was, I think, a question, a great question, Kevin. Exactly. This idea of slandering the good or being confused with the good. This question probably came a while ago. What's good, what's evil? Jesus was facing these very things. He was being maligned, slandered. He was being accused of being in cahoots with Beelzebub. And indeed, this issue of kind of demonization and the good and the evil Jesus faced. Yeah. It's interesting that, I mean, we could do a study on that and kind of think about what is it about people slandering others and the justification or the confusion about good and evil. I think there's something there to think about. This is why, and if you've listened to my videos long enough, you're going to hear me go off on a rant on this, that the goal of the gospel for salvation for us, that our salvation, it involves a restoration and renewing of our minds in order that we would be able to discern things properly. So look at Hebrews 5:14. Look at that in context, discerning the good and the evil. Look at Romans 12:2. Look at Ephesians 4:20 through 24. These verses will talk about renewing of the mind for restoration and proper discernment of right and wrong. And it seems like the evil one, or the accusation of the evil one, is somehow involved with this discernment or the corruption of the discernment capacity. And so Jesus is a part of the restoration of that discernment capacity. But it's problematic if the person who comes, who is perfect love, perfect kindness, goodness, Jesus, if he shows up and people are calling him Beelzebub, or that he's only able to do these things because of Beelzebub, that is a serious discernment problem, a serious discernment problem. And of course, that's being thrown about and accused of people. In fact, last Wednesday, I was accused of that in Facebook posts, and it was a pretty mild Facebook post, but it just kind of kept exploding. And people are like, Jesus is weeping over your views. You don't, my Jesus wouldn't be accepting what your Jesus, and that I'm supporting the Antichrist and all this kind of stuff. And I'm simply saying, actually, I just want transparency. I want transparency. I want to know where my money, our taxpayer money, is going. Anyway, but it's a time of opposition, of big opposition, and people are pitted against people, and I think it's very sinister and evil. The evil one is playing with our fears and anxieties such that we're attacking people and not even able to communicate. In fact, I responded to one person's post, and the person just flat out deleted my post. Just said, no, I don't want, I'm afraid this was a bot or something like that. So we have to be able to converse with each other. And yeah, so I think it's interesting. Okay, so that brings us to um, verse 7. But if, but if the truth of God, and the word aletheia here is the subject of the if clause. We've got another condition. If the truth of God is abounds, this is aorist tense, abounded, if it abounded in my lie, and the truth of God can mean like God's truthfulness in terms of faithfulness. So if the truthfulness of God, or the truth of God, the faithfulness of God, so God being true, if God being true was magnified, was abounded, perisevo has to do with like abound or make more abundant, by my lying, by my falsehood. And the goal of this abounding is for his glory. Then why still am I also, there's a ke here. So this kago is ke plus an ego. So there's a ke, and there's an ego underneath there. And that ke means also, it's a thematic, what's called a thematic addition. Why am I being judged as a sinner? So if the truthfulness of God, the trueness of God, by my falsehood is abounding for his glory. That's all the if clause. That's all the if clause. It's a past simple supposition. Something was true in the past. If this was true in the past, then why am I being judged as a sinner? Now, what is my falsehood? What does my falsehood mean? Well, this emo is from what's called the possessive adjective, emos. Now, this is an alternative way of indicating my. Paul could have just used mu, mu with the genitive. The mu with the genitive this is actually a more common construction, mu. So why does Paul use mo? Well, this mo is a more emphatic, more marked construction. I think I would translate it my own falsehood. Now, if the so if the truthfulness of God by my own falseness abounded to his glory, why am I still being judged as a sinner? So, past reality, God's condemned me. Truth in God's truthfulness, his truthfulness exposes my falsehood. And this is all part of God's righteousness, I would say. This abounded for his glory. Why would I still be judged as a sinner? Now, this is a terrible kind of excuse, apparently, right? It's an excuse. It's someone is wanting to get off the hook, so to speak. Who's doing the judging? Presumably, I guess God. There's a lot of judgment language here. God is the one who will judge the world. God is the one who is presently bringing the wrath. He is the one who will be victorious in his judging. So part of the gospel being revealed is indeed that God is judging. There's a judgment on the world revealed in the gospel. There's a judgment on the world. And so this question is it's coming out of this it seems like someone is trying to get out of the consequence. Why am I also being judged as a sinner? So at this point, Paul is adopting the vantage point, or he's speaking in first person. I don't think he's speaking about himself, although I tried to work out a way of thinking about it that it seems like he does start to include himself more and more in the discourse. Even by saying, I'm speaking in human terms, that's referring to himself. He does talk about our unrighteousness. So at this point, he seems to be identifying himself with somebody. What will we say? Either that, or it's this is the interlocutor's voice. This is the interlocutor's voice. But eventually, this interlocutive voice comes down to first person. Why am I being judged as a sinner? So I don't think that this is Paul's voice here. This is for the sake of an argument, someone who is moving from a plural, what shall we say, our unrighteousness. This is someone who's an individual. Why am I being judged as a sinner? So it's a bad excuse for continuing to live as a sinner. It's a bad excuse. And it seems like that's what's going on here, because in verse 8, he adds on. he adds on a statement. That's what the KED does, is it adds something of equal status. So this question, this kind of statement, well, it's really a question. T, why? Why am I still being judged? And then you have another question. So you have question upon question. So I think if I were to punctuate this text, I'd let this question end right there. Why am I still being judged as a sinner? And why not, just as we are blasphemed, and just as some say that we say this, let us do the bad things in order that the good things may become. Now, if we do that, if we let this be a stop with its own question, but then understanding that it's going to be opening up or continued with the ke, then what this allows is that this is a question expecting a negative response. That question mark, that may, we'd have to kind of word it a little bit differently, and of a similar kind of inappropriate move. It isn't that just as we are blasphemed, and just as some say that we say, let us do evil that good may abound, is it? No. No, it's not. So it's not as we're blasphemed. It's not as some are saying that we say, let us do that good may abound. No, that's not where we go. That's not where we go. That's not the solution. So someone says, it is also that the revelation of the gospel is the instigation of God's wrath as well as revealing it simultaneously. Yeah. Yeah. The wrath and salvation are simultaneously revealed. Now, here, my lectures on Jesus, which I haven't posted yet, that I did last semester, go back to Malachi, look at chapter 3 of Malachi, where there's a longing for the revelation of God's justice and a proper distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. This is part of what God's kingdom does, is it starts to distinguish. And that's a hoped for thing in the coming of Jesus, is that there would once again be a distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. Yeah. So yeah, that's what's revealed in the gospel. Now, the last thing to get to is this relative pronoun clause. This is kind of a tough one. So this one technically is hanging back onto probably goes back to the some. They say, some say, whose judgment is just. Now, this is probably judgment of them. The judgment of them is just. And who's been doing the judging? It's been God. God is the one who's doing the judging. So this relative pronoun clause starts a subordinate clause, but it's intricately linked to this blasphemy and slandering of Paul. So that's how serious it is. It's a part of that activity against Paul, against Paul and company, who are being slandered and falsely accused as saying, and Paul is offsetting this relative pronoun clause as like the last statement before he has a reset that we'll look at next time. This reset that's coming, what then? What do we do next? And this verb is gnarly. We'll look at that next time. But it's a final statement of judgment. It's a final statement of judgment. Their condemnation, the condemnation of them who are maligning me and reversing good and evil, is just. So there's a reality here, and this indeed goes back to like Luke 12, the question, the same kind of struggle over ultimate reality and understanding God working in the world that Jesus faced. He was maligned. There was a confusion over good and bad. Same thing is happening with Paul. And Paul is simultaneously affirming a judgment while talking about God's right to judge. So part of our work in the gospel is to confess God's judgment. Say, this is just. This is God's judgment is just in the gospel. And that's a little bit of an uncomfortable position to be in because we're included in some of the initial, right, the initial judgment. I mean, we're the ones who say we've made mistakes. I've been a sinner. I confess that I have sinned, and I agree with God's judgment. And where there's very serious, obvious, clear instances of reversing of right and wrong, I have to also call that out and say that's to be judged. That's to be judged. God's going to judge that. And the reason I say that is not that I feel like I'm better. I'm not doing it out of virtue signaling. I'm doing it to say you need to repent. You need to repent because that's a very serious offense. And what's interesting about the latter New Testament books, the latter New Testament, not later, but latter. Look at Jude, how Jude ends. Look at how First John ends. Look at how some of these books end. They end with helping people come out of sin, to be gentle. Galatians ends this way as well. That it is indeed a part of our work is that we do have to identify people's sins. Someone who's stuck in a sin, those of you who are spiritually mature should go to them and not be tempted, and so Paul deals with this in chapter 6. Look at chapter 6 of Galatians. Look at the end of Jude. We do need to identify things. We do need to have a God's eye view of things, but not out of a sense of arrogance or virtue signaling, but out of a sense of soberness, humility, and to call it out. And so here Paul calls it out. There, the condemnation of them, that's a objective genitive, is just. And this is quite a serious issue. Let us do evil that good may result. And Paul's like, nope, that is nothing to do with God's righteousness. That has nothing to do with my gospel. Even though I'm being slandered and accused of saying this, that has nothing to do with that. I am putting distance and agreeing with a judgment that is wrong. And that's kind of where he leads us to. So these verses are tough. There's a kind of a logic there. Scholars are confused about why they're here. I understand that. But I think Paul is talking with Jews or Judeans who are struggling with the gospel message and condemnation. Someone who is struggling with that. And despite our faithlessness, our falseness, our unrighteousness, all of these attributes in the positive God has. And we don't just stay false, faithless, and unjust as if somehow God is going to be magnified or glorified in our sinfulness because God is so much better, and this sinfulness makes God's goodness and truthfulness better. Paul says, no, that's a false conclusion. And actually, we're being maligned on that point, which I distance. That's nothing to do with us. And so that's what's achieved in these verses. And I think that's a very important point. We've connected to Paul elsewhere. We've connected to Jesus' tradition. And so next time, we're going to continue on with verse 9. Thanks, everybody.